honour, chivalry, chastity, and faith. These were the words that the poor men soldiers of Christ lived by. Shrouded in myth and destiny, their rise and fall is to this day a controversial subject. How could a religion such as Christianity, founded on pacifist ideals, produce a military order that would become so powerful and influential in politics and finance? The answer lies in necessity. Pope Urban II understood the discontent and difficulties that were emerging from the feudal system, and thus published a papal bull known as the Truce of God. These directions were designed to channel violence and discontent towards a common foe and a common good, the First Crusade against the threat from the East. The Council of Clermont in central France was convened by Pope Urban II during the second half of November 1095. It was largely concerned with the Truce of God, the device by which the Church had for half a century been trying to limit feudal warfare, which was having a devastating effect upon the land. Population growth, shortage of land, and petty civil wars had contributed to a feeling of insecurity and desperation at all levels of society. There had been floods and plagues in 1094, followed by a drought and famine in 1095. A shower of meteorites in April 1095 besieged a great movement of peoples, it was said, and led to an apocalyptic note to the social and economic problems. The fall of Toledo in Spain, which in the West is known as the legendary Reconquista. In fact, reaction against Arab imperialism had begun long before that. Just as Muslim armies had occupied the Middle East, North Africa and Europe, so the Christian counterattack was on several fronts. In the West, the Arabs overran Spain and struck deep into France, to within 150 miles of the English Channel, before they were beaten back by Charles Martel between Poitiers and Tours in 732, though it did not prevent the Muslims from holding positions on the coast of Languedoc and Provence for several decades to come. Through the 11th century, Pisa, Genoa, and Catalonia fought campaigns in the western Mediterranean to free Sicily, Sardinia, and Majorca from Arab rule. In 1063, Pope Alexander II gave his papal blessing to Iberian Christians in their wars against the Muslims, granting a remission of sins to those who were killed in battle. The recovery of Toledo from the Arabs in 1085 was a major victory. The northern third of Spain was now back in Christian hands, though not until the fall of Granada in 1492 would the Reconquista succeed in driving the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula altogether. In the east, the Byzantines were scoring victories in the eastern Mediterranean. Already in the 10th century, were capturing Crete from the Muslims in 961 and Cyprus 4 years later. The Byzantines also recovered great swaths of territory in the Middle East. In 969, they captured Antioch, and shortly afterwards they took Aleppo and Latakia, along the coastal strip extending clear down through Syria and near to Tripoli in northern Lebanon. The Muslim inhabitants were left undisturbed, and the local Muslim leaders were made vassals of the Byzantine Empire, but now they were made to pay taxes for which the Christians were exempt, while destroyed churches were rebuilt, and the freedom to convert from Islam to Christianity, or vice versa, was guaranteed. In 975, under the Emperor John Tismekes, the Byzantines launched a crusade with the intervention of recovering Jerusalem, which was still an overwhelmingly Christian city. Marching out with his army from Antioch, Tismekes took Damascus, then advanced into Palestine, where Nazareth and Caesarea opened the gates to him, and the Muslim authorities at Jerusalem pleaded for terms. But first the emperor turned towards the Mediterranean to clear the enemy from the coastal castles, only to die suddenly in 976, before he could return his attention to Jerusalem. For the next century, the Byzantines remained in control of northern Syria, but no closer to the Holy Land. Many of those who came on the First Crusade went home when it was over, and few of the pilgrims who followed in their wake chose to settle in the Holy Land, owing to insufficient Frankish immigration. The Crusader states would always be short of fighting men. The king of Jerusalem, the prince of Antioch, and the counts of Edessa and Tripoli could between them raise no more than 2,000 knights. The towns were made secure, but travellers along the roads were vulnerable to brigands and sudden enemy raids. Seawolf of Canterbury, who visited the Holy Land in 1102, described how parties of pilgrims landing at Jaffa were exposed to attack as they journeyed along the mountain road to Jerusalem. Pilgrims who wearied and fell behind, or groups that were vulnerably small, were preyed upon by bands of nomadic Bedouin who lived in the surrounding wilderness. The bandits did not hesitate to kill to get at the money sewn into the travellers' clothes. Corpses were left to rot along the route to Jerusalem because it was too dangerous for the companions to leave their party to give them a decent, proper Christian burial. There was danger not only from the brigands, but from Turkish forces in the north and Egyptians in the south. A Russian, recounting his pilgrimage in 1106 to 1107, was referring to the Fatimid Egyptians who held Ascalon, this is south of Jaffa, when he wrote on his visit to the Church of St. George of Lydia on the Jaffa-Jerusalem road that there are many springs here. Travellers rest by the water, but with great fear, for a deserted place, and nearby in the town of Ascalon, from which the Saracens sallied forth and killed travellers on the road. The Russian's journey to Galilee, which took him near the town of Bazan, was no less hazardous. 7 rivers flow from this town, and great reeds grow along these rivers, and many great palm trees stand between the crowd and the forest. This place is terrible and difficult of access, for here live fierce pagan Saracens who attack travellers on the froads and along the rivers. An especially shocking attack took place in Easter 1019, when a large party of 700 unarmed pilgrims, both men and women, set out from Jerusalem for the River Jordan. They were travelling, in the words of a German chronicler, with joy and a cheerful heart, when they were set upon by an Egyptian sortie from Ascalon. 300 pilgrims were killed, and another 60 were captured to be sold as slaves. The formation of the Templars arose out of these conditions of insecurity on the roads, and the murder, rape, enslavement and robbery of unarmed pilgrims. Only recently, a group of 9 French knights, most prominently Hugh of Paynes, a knight of Champagne who had fought in the First Crusade, and Godfrey of St. Omer in Picardy, had proposed to the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Warmond of Pagony, and King Baldwin II, who had succeeded his cousin in 1118, that for the salvation of their souls they form a lay community, or perhaps even withdraw into the contemplative life of a monastery. Instead, Baldwin, alive to the urgent dangers confronting travellers in his kingdom, persuaded Hugh of Paynes and his companions to save their souls by protecting pilgrims on the road. And, as one chronicler put it, they were to take vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, but they were also to defend pilgrims against brigands and rapists. These to massacre along the road to the River Jordan persuasively drove home their king's views, and on Christmas Day, 1119, Hugh and his companions took their vows before the Patriarch in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, calling themselves in Latin the Paupers Communitatis Christi, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. The Knights of the Temple were founded in Jerusalem in 1119 and officially recognised at some point between 14th of January and the 13th of September of the year 1120. But the truth was that no one really noticed that they'd been founded. The Templars did not arrive on a wave of popular demand, nor was their creation the product of some far-sighted planning between the nascent Crusader states and religious authorities in Western Christendom. No surviving chronicles of the immediate time, either Christian or Muslim, paid any attention to the first historians of the order, and it was only several generations later that the story of the Templars' earliest origins was even written down, by which time it was coloured by much that the order had become. But this was hardly surprising. Much like Jerusalem's rulers and inhabitants, the historians and gossip collectors of the Holy Land in the year of 1120 had other, bigger things to worry about. The Crusaders who stayed to rule in the Holy Land were to the Muslims foreign invaders, trying to establish their command over a mixed population of Sunni and Shia Muslims, Jews, Greek and Syrian Orthodox Christians, Samaritans and poor settlers from all over Europe. This was a society naturally divided by language, religion, culture and loyalty, in which everyone was trying to get by an environment that sometimes seemed naturally hostile to settlement. In 1113 to 1114, Syria and Palestine were shaken by severe earthquakes, which raised whole towns and left suffocating to death between collapsed buildings. Virtually every springtime brought plagues of mice and locusts that swarmed over vines and fields, running crops and stripping the bark from the trees. From time to time, strange eclipses stained the moon blood red. All of these things played on the settlers' superstitious minds, and it was as if the land wished to cast out the Crusaders and the heavens to punish them for their conquest. These difficult conditions did little to dissuade the Templars in their new mission. Official acceptance had come for the new order at Nablus in January 1120, when the 9 members of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ were normally introduced to an assembly of lay and spiritual leaders from throughout the lands of Outremer. That is the kingdom of Christ in the Holy Land, from Tripoli to Jerusalem. In this year too, they were first attracted through the attention of a powerful visitor to Outremer, Fulk V, Count of Anjou, who, on his return home, granted them an annual revenue, an example that was soon followed by other French nobles which added to the allowance they were already receiving from the canons of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Yet altogether, these amounted to only a modest income, and individually, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ were genuinely poor, and dressed only in donated clothes, meaning they had no distinctive uniform. The white tunic, emblazoned with a red cross, which is so indicative of the Templars and so highly recognisable, was to come later. Their seal alludes to the brotherhood in poverty by depicting two knights, perhaps Hugh of Paynes and Godfrey of St. Omer, having to share a single horse. They were also given the use of another hand-me-down. After the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, the king had made do with the Al-Aqsa Mosque for his palace, but now he had built a new palace to the west, and he had given this mosque over to the poor fellow soldiers. They made it their headquarters, residing there and using it to store arms, clothing and food, while stabling their horses in a great underground vault at the southeast corner of the Temple Mount. As the vaults were thought to have been Solomon's stables, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque was known as the Mosque of the Templum Solomonius, because it was said and believed to have been built on the site of Solomon's temple, hence the Knights Templar. It was not long before the Knights had encompassed the association in their name. They have become known as the Pobres Communities Christi Templic Solomonici, the four fellow soldiers of Christ and the Temple Solomon, and as I've said, the Templars. The Christian states of Outremer enjoyed nearly half a century of security after the First Crusade, thanks to the divisions among the Muslim neighbours, the Fatimids in Egypt, and the numerous Turkish-controlled statelets in Syria and Iraq, who often fought against one another. Occasionally, there were clashes between the Franks and Muslims, but they were minor affairs and did not threaten the existence of Outremer. Indeed, Muslim princes made alliances with the Christians against their most common enemy. The most important of these enemies was Zengi, a Seljuk Turk, who began his career in 1127 when, on behalf of the moribund Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, he made himself Atabech, or governor of Mosul in northern Iraq. By means of war and intimidation, Zengi soon extended his authority over much of Muslim Syria, and he would have taken Damascus too, but for an alliance between his Turkish ruler and King Fulk of Jerusalem. In the event of Zengi's greatest victory was his conquest of the county of Edessa in 1144. The first state founded by the Crusaders, Edessa was the first to fall, and Arab chroniclers later looked back on this triumph as the start of the jihad that would drive the Franks from the east. In the west, the loss of Edessa touched off the Second Crusade, a huge campaign by sea and land, this time led by two European kings, but the crusade may never reach the Holy Land at all had it not been for the Templars, and when unexpectedly it failed, they became convenient scapegoats. Yet again, the gathering forces of the Muslim Jihad Outremer could not have survived, as it did for another 150 years, without the religious conviction and military prowess of the Brotherhood of Christian warriors. Unfortunately for the Franks, they were often engaged in petty quarrels themselves, and when Zengi's large and powerful army turned its unwelcome attention upon Edessa in 1144, Outremer was divided. The Count of Edessa, Jocelyn II, was at odds with the Prince of Antioch. The Count of Tripoli was only vaguely interested in the events so far as to the east, and in Jerusalem, King Fulk had just died, leaving the government in the hands of Queen Meselende as a regent for the child Baldwin III, their 13-year-old son. Consequently, Zengi found his attacks opposed only by the logical forces of Edessa itself. The other Crusader states fringed the Mediterranean, but Edessa was landlocked. It lay beyond the Euphrates. A day's ride east of the river, its population was made up of Christians to the east, Chaldeans and Armenians, who were more devoted to trade than skilled in the use of arms. Westerners rarely visited the city, and those Franks who lived there had mostly married the local Christians, so its defence was entrusted largely to mercenaries. When Zengi laid siege to the city, he came up against the more formidable walls, but in the words of William of Tyre, all these defences could be of use against the enemy only if there were men willing to fight for their freedom, men who would resist the foe valiantly. The defences would be useless, however, if there were none among the besieged who were willing to serve as defenders. Towers, walls and earthquakes are of little value if a city unless they are defended to a man to defend them. Zengi found the town bereft of defenders and was much encouraged. Help was sent too late from Jerusalem and Tripoli, where Antioch sent no help at all. On Christmas Eve 1144, Zengi's forces breached the walls and rushed into the streets and houses of the city. They slew with their swords the citizen they encountered, sparing neither age, condition, nor sex, wrote William of Tyre. and they enslaved any who survived. At first, the West was slow to react to the fall of Edessa. In autumn 1145, Pope Eugenius III wrote to King Louis VII of France, asking him to undertake a new crusade to the east. At Christmas, Louis summoned his barons and told them that he was taking the cross, and invited them to do so, but their response was poor. Louis was young, only 25. He was seen as impetuous, weak and greedy. He had angered his barons by recently seizing land from the Count of Champagne, but the barons did not agree to convene at Easter 1146 at Islay in Burgundy. Meanwhile, Louis arranged that Bernard of Charolais would speak at Vézelay. Not only was Bernard the friend of popes and kings, Eugenius had been a monk at Clairvaux, and the king's brother had recently joined the Caesarians there, but his asceticism, conviction and eloquence combined to make the most formidable spiritual figure of the age. At word that Bernard would speak, such a crowd of aristocrats, admirers from all over France were drawn to Vézelay. As Clement and Pope Urban called for the First Crusade, the cathedral was not big enough to contain the throng, and a platform was erected in the fields outside the town. This was an age like no other. Bernard told the crowd, God had found new ways to save the faithful. The fall of Edessa was a gift from God. It was an opportunity created by God to save men's souls. Look at the skill he is using to save you. Consider the depth of his love and be astonished. Sinners, this is a plan not made by man, but proceeding from the heart of divine love. Amid the roars of Deo salvat, so many came forward to take the cross that Bernard had to tear his own habit into strips. King Louis was the first among them, followed by his barons, many of whom were his sons and grandsons of original crusaders. Bernard was able to write a few days later to the Pope, You ordered, I obeyed. I opened my mouth, I spoke, and at once the crusaders have multiplied to infinity. Villages and towns are now deserted. You will scarcely find one man for every 7 women. Everywhere you see widows whose husbands are still alive. Bernard precourse his message further, travelling to the north of France and to Flanders, and addressing a letter to the Pope of England and to the people of England, explaining that Jesus, the Son of God, was losing the land in which he had walked among men for more than 30 years. Your land, Bernard told the English, is well known to be rich in young and vigorous men. The world is full of their praises, and the renown of their courage is on the lips of all. Do not miss this opportunity. Take the sign of the cross, and once you will have indulgence for all the sins which you confess with a contrite heart. It does not cost you much to buy, and if you wear it with humility, you will find that is the kingdom of heaven. On the 27th of April, 1147, King Louis VII and Pope Eugenius III came to the Paris Temple, which had become the European headquarters of the order, to discuss plans for the Second Crusade. Also in attendance were 4 archbishops and 130 Templar knights, with at least as many sergeants and squires. Here, it was agreed that Templars would accompany the French army to the east, and it was probably on this occasion that the Pope conferred to the Templars the right to emblazon their white robes with the Red Cross, symbolising their willingness to die in defence of the Holy Land. The Pope had appointed the Templar treasurer to receive the tax that had been imposed on all church goods to finance the crusade. It was the start of a fateful relationship that would last for over a century and a half, with the Paris Temple serving in effect as the treasury of France. One by one, the great castles and monuments of the Templars fell, and piece by piece, Outremont was disassembled by the Muslim conquerors led by Saladin. In a series of devastating campaigns, Baybars captured Caesarea and Haifa in 1265, the Templar castle at Safed in 1266, Jaffa and the Temple castle at Beaufort in 1268, and then struck at Antioch in the north, which he captured the same year, treating its inhabitants with a murderous brutality that shocked even Muslim chroniclers. The Temple castle at Bagras in the Amos Mountains was now utterly isolated. Bagras had been their first castle, but now the Templars had no choice but to abandon it. Chastel Blanc, the Templars, was surrendered in 1271, along with the Hospitallers' great castle of Crac des Chevaliers. Baybars then marched on Montfort between Acre and the Sea of Galilee, and that too soon handed over to the Muslims by its garrison of Teutonic knights. With all their great inland fortresses taken, the Franks were pinned to the remaining coastal defences, crucially Acre and Tripoli, both powerful fortified cities, and their Templar stronghold of Tortosa, which held out against Saladin, and in their castle of Athlit, south of Haifa. But meanwhile the Franks gained some relief from Prince Edward, the future Edward I of England, led a fresh crusade to the east, and in 1272 persuaded Baybars to agree to a 10-year truce. Acre, capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, headquarters of the military orders, was the most powerfully defended city of Outremer, and according to the Temple of Tyre, he knew it well. The temple was the strongest place of the city, largely situated along the seashore like a castle. At its entrance it had a high and strong tower, the wall of which was 28 feet thick. On each side of the tower was a smaller tower, and on each of these was a gilded lion passant, as large as an ox. On the other side, near the street of the Passants, there was another tower, and near this tower on the street of St. Anne was a large and noble place, which was the Master's. There was another ancient tower on the seashore, which Saladin had built 100 years before, in which the temple kept its treasure, and it was so close to the sea that the waves splashed against it. Within the temple area, there were the beautiful and noble houses, which I shall not describe here. Eventually Jerusalem itself would fall, Richard the Lionheart, King of the English, being unable to retake it, coming within sight, but never fated to enter its hallowed gates. And with this, Outremer came to an end. It was Philip IV of France who would seal the Templars' fate. At dawn, October 13th, 1307, the soldiers of King Philip IV captured all Templars found in France, on trumped-up charges of black magic, sodomy, heresy and blasphemy against the browbeaten Pope Boniface. They were tried and mostly executed. The very last Templar Grand Master, James of Valais, went to his funeral pyre with the strength, courage and determination of which his order was known. And thus, the time of the Templars came to an end. Many of them refused to recant and refused to cooperate with the authorities. Thus, it was so that the Templars passed into legend, into the order that they are today.